Hello, Scottish Independence Convention. I spent the last 2 years making speeches to a wall of Tories, otherwise known as a brick wall. So it's great to be back with some real people. We're going to talk about money. I just want to point out before I start, I'm wearing my Scottish Friends of Catalonia badge. And I just want to send a message across the ether to my dear friend Raúl Romera, the legitimate foreign minister of the Catalan Republic. Raúl is currently incarcerated in a Madrid prison, along with a whole other group of Catalan ministers. Raúl, we're coming to get you out. Right, we're going to talk about money. It's a complicated thing. I think we lost, and substantially lost, the referendum in 2014 because we couldn't convince people on the money question what currency we're going to have, could we operate it properly. People just didn't buy the message. Now, there's an interesting kind of gap here, because when you conduct opinion polls, there's been a lot of opinion polls the last 2 years, and you ask people now, supposing Scotland was independent, what currency should we use? And the polls are pretty consistent. They say about 2/3 of people say, keep the pound. So this is a bit odd. One hand, people really didn't trust us when we said in 2014, independence, we keep the pound. And then we say, well, what do you really want? They say, keep the pound. Now, I interpret this contradiction. People want to be convinced that if they take the leap towards independence, we know what we're doing and we're going to run the show. On the other hand, they know what they know, they're nervous, so if you ask them, what do you want to do? They'll say, well, keep things as close to the way it is at the moment. It's not that they're wedded to the pound, it's just you need to convince them, and they want to be convinced, which is why we didn't do as well as we should have on the independence referendum 3 years ago. Now, there we go. The key question is, where does the money come from? If we don't get this one right, then the technology doesn't really matter. Now, I've got 15 minutes basically to explain this. Now, you're on the doorstep when the time comes. You're going to have a couple of minutes, right? Max. So I think you should listen to the various presentations this afternoon, and then take a leaf out of the Catalan independence movement, because what they started off doing was holding kitchen table meetings. And what they do is they get some friends in, give them a cup of coffee, give them a sandwich, and have a chat about something complex. You can do it that way. We have to begin to build from here. Okay, where does the money come from? This is a $64,000 question, really, literally, because if we don't know where the money comes from, then we can't do anything. Money comes from three bases. It will come from the government prints it, banks lend it, and the central bank makes it up. Central bank, Mark Carney's central bank in London, he's made up about £500 billion worth of pound notes in order to prop up the City of London and the stock exchange. Is why the stock exchange is booming. It's all artificial. But most money is made by commercial banks. What they do is they lend. And when they lend, they don't go to a shoebox at the back of the room and take some cash out and give it to you. They make up a deposit and they lend it to you. And you think you've got something. It's something made up by a bank. And when the bank needs to keep its accounts in order to say, well, where did the money come from? It balances the books by borrowing from another bank. And it goes round and round in a loop. It's a kind of pass the parcel. And when you ask, where does it start? Nobody knows. Money is just there, invented by banks. So if you want to control your economy, if you want to control credit, if you want to control what happens, then you have to control where the money comes from, which is the banks. So when they're on the doorstep and people say, well, what are you going to do? You say, well, what's the question? We need to know where the money comes from, and wherever it comes from, you need to control it. Right, options for a Scottish currency. Very briefly, obviously 4. You can keep sterling, which we tried the last time. You can have the euro, you can have a Scottish pound, or in some way we can link the Scottish pound to sterling. I'll go through them in turn very quickly. Right, keeping sterling. I think it's important to understand why the Scottish Government originally came to the conclusion we should try and keep sterling in one shape or form. Even if we want to move away from that, you have to know what the starting point was. Now, business operates in pounds. You know, if you move away from pound sterling, business gets confused, they get worried, and you could indeed set up an opposition to independence from business based on the currency question, and that would be a bad thing. So I think basically Alex Salmond originally, the first time round, wanted us to keep business sweet, keep them off the agenda, so keep the pound. If you keep the pound, then we know what prices of everything are north and south of the border. If you sell south of the border, you know what you're getting. If you sell south of the border, vice versa, right? I think one of the crucial ones, there was the time bomb that was ticking away, was pensions. Post-independence, large numbers of people will get their pensions still from the Treasury in London. The legacy pensions. If you worked all your life, you've got a state pension, you've got a civil service pension, it's coming up from London. Now, post-independence, they'll still be paying that. That's their contractual obligation. But if your pension is being paid in pound sterling, and we have a Scottish currency, then there's some kind of conversion. Do you get the same amount in real value as when you spend it in the supermarket? What if the currencies change against one another? Does that mean that your pension buys less in Scotland? Possibly more. You don't know. That insecurity, I think, creates a problem. And I think Scottish Government, last time around, just wanted to park that as a problem. Enough difficulty trying to explain what you still get your pension, because it would still come from London, without getting into the issue of value. So we have to address those issues if we feel it's time to move on from keeping sterling. Right, the arguments against. Right, the obvious one last time round was they told us to get lost, and they'll do that again. To get the cooperation, to be able to work with the Bank of England, to work with the UK monetary authorities, that is denied us, and I think it will be denied us again. There was a way around that. I mean, most central banks in large federal states have regional appointments to their central bank. The Bank of Canada, which Mark Carney came from, the board of that bank has representatives from all the provinces. The US Federal Reserve, on the Federal Reserve Board, are representatives from across the United States. You could do that now, and actually we tried hard in Westminster over the last couple of years to see if we could get that to happen. We were denied even that within the United Kingdom system. So they're not going to let us, they're not going to give us a seat at the table. But more important than that, if you keep the pound, then you end up keeping the interest rate that's being set by the Bank of England, and as a result of that, you get to keep the same external exchange rate with currencies abroad. If you keep the pound, whatever other advantages you get, the ones we've mentioned, you end up with the Bank of England and whoever appoints the Bank of England, which is the British government, the Treasury, you get them ultimately setting interest rates which determine what credit you get and what you can invest, and determining your external exchange rate, which determines what you can export. So you give up a whole raft of political power. I think that's what really confused people in 2014. Why do you want independence, but you're leaving all that power at the Bank of England and the UK Treasury? There's no way around that. Any form of keeping sterling, whether we keep it in agreement with the UK, rest of the UK, or whether we go alone and just keep sterling, you give up monetary power. Now, the first slide was all about where does money come from? It comes from the banks. Ultimately, the way you control the banks is through your monetary policy, your interest rate policy set by the Bank of England, and your Bank of England directions to the banks. So if we keep sterling, gives us some advantages, but you give up ultimately a lot of political power. What about the euro? It's an option. Opinion polls say about 5% of people in Scotland would like to use the euro. Bottom line, though, is that if we were independent, we'd have to set up our own economy, run our economy, align our economy with the rest of Europe before they would let us into using the euro. That would take, best guess, 5-10 years. So using the euro is not a short-term option post-independence. So you end up back where you started. What currency do we use? Do we keep sterling, or do we go another direction? If we stay within the Eurozone, of course, there are also quite significant limitations on borrowing imposed by the European Central Bank and the various European rules. And I think ultimately we have to remember what the European Union and the Central Bank European Central Bank did to Greece. If you get into economic trouble, you don't have the power within the Eurozone to make the kind of economic monetary decisions to get your economy out of the hole. Instead, they impose austerity on you. So that, by a process of elimination, ends up with some form of Scottish currency, which for simplicity's sake, we'll just call Scottish pound. I was sitting having coffee in Westminster one day with a friend of mine. We were working on a project about a Scottish currency, working some of the details out. And my friend was a very old childhood friend of Ed Miliband. And Ed Miliband walks by and he says, "Oh, Richard, what are you doing here?" And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're not working with them, are you?" And Richard said, "Yes." And so Ed Miliband said, "Well, what is you doing?" Richard said, Richard's an economist, bank historian, very, very, very renowned guy. And Richard said, "Oh, we're working out some of the details of a Scottish currency." And Miliband said, "Oh, you mean the groat, the groat." And I mean, that's the kind of sophisticated level that you get at Westminster. So we'll call it the Scottish pound. And why have a Scottish pound? It allows you, I mean, bottom line on the door, you can do your own thing economically. It gives you power over the currency, power over the banks, power over interest rates. You can set your own interest rate, you can set your own exchange rate, you control the flow of credit. Where currently the Scottish government is working hard to create a Scottish investment bank, which is a great idea. Hope we'll get that soon. But ultimately, if you're going down that road, the logic is to go the whole way and control your entire monetary architecture. And that's what the Scottish currency does for you. It has some nice side effects. You can create, we all know about the Norwegian pension fund, stroke wealth fund, which they get from their oil money. But there's other ways of creating sovereign wealth funds, by the way. Chinese have a big one. But what happens if you control your own currency? There are, of course, multinational companies who are paying their taxes, and they will be paying taxes, let me tell you, in an independent Scotland. If you're paying your taxes, or you're paying your workers, or you need access to Scottish money, you have to buy Scottish money from the Scottish government, or the Scottish money, well, the Scottish government's monetary authorities, central bank, or whatever we create. So you take foreign currency and you buy Scottish pounds if you want to operate in Scotland, pay wages, pay taxes. So there are a lot of companies every year taking their foreign currency and they are buying Scottish pounds. Their foreign currency ends up, after a certain remove, with the Scottish government. So you can then use that foreign currency, it'll build up very quickly. I mean, the foreign currency will come from our whiskey exports, from our oil exports. It will end up, and you put that actual foreign currency that you've got from creating Scottish pounds and selling them to those companies, you can put it in a sovereign wealth fund and you can invest that. So very quickly, the Scottish Sovereign Wealth Fund could be investing in, say, lots of stocks and shares in the City of London. So we could end up owning a chunk of the rest of the UK economy, which would be fun. The other thing, of course, is that if you have an economic problem, and the capitalist economy world cycle goes in cycles, goes in ups and downs. You have global financial crisis. You have to deal with that. You're on a choppy sea. You have to row. You have to keep balance. So controlling your own currency gives the Scottish government the ability to borrow, which would underpin. I'm not a great advocate of massive debts to pass on to future generations, but you need to borrow. It's a way of managing the ups and downs of the economy. If you print your own currency, create your own currency, run your own banking system, then it's much more easy because essentially Scottish people lend to the Scottish government, and that's a quite a safe way to do it. There we go. There are problems. Nothing comes free. So, what about business confidence question? If we create our own currency, business has to transition to that. We have to persuade them that it's a good thing. I think we can. I think we can make a case that we will be in a position to give interest rates and credit flows that will help Scottish business and actually help them to grow. We have to make the case, start making the case now, not just afterwards. How do we create international confidence? If you've got your own currency, we'll say, well, what's it worth in dollars? What's it worth in euros? And that's a concern. We will have to have foreign currency reserves to back a Scottish pound. But as I said earlier, people are buying Scottish pounds because they want to operate here, they want to pay wages here. They are taking oil out of Scottish territory, they're taking our whiskey, they're selling it abroad. That earns foreign currency, that will flow back, and that will form the basis for our foreign currency reserves. So I actually think within 10 years we could have very, very substantial foreign currency reserves, much better actually than the rest of UK. And I should just say, of course, that if we are at the point of independence, we will fall heir to the assets of the UK state, and we will fall heir to our share of the Bank of England's assets, and so that will give us pro rata a good start. Pensions. The pension issue is, I think, the key one. We have to persuade the pensioners who are getting their payments from London still post-independence, paid in pounds when it's converted into Scottish currency, that it's still valuable. Now, one of the interesting things is if people on the doorstep say to you, well, what happens if the pound falls in value? The Scottish pound falls in value. Well, your pension will be higher for a start, because the Scottish pound went down against sterling, and then you're paid your pension in sterling, then you're richer. So if anything went wrong, tell people on the doorstep, actually you're going to be richer. It's not going to happen, but that's one of your little fail-safes. But I think we have to persuade pensioners that if they want a decent pension, we have to have an economy that's stable and sustainable and grows in a sustainable fashion. The only way we can do that is to control our own destinies, and to do that we need to control our own money. It's as simple as that. Right, final point, right, sterlingization. If we keep a Scottish pound, we would have to keep it valued against. Some people say, well, let's have a Scottish pound, but make it exactly equal to the pound sterling. If we did that, then I think that's a dangerous route, because George Soros or somebody's going to come along and say, I don't trust you to keep Scottish government, to keep the pound Scots equal to the pound sterling, and so I'm going to start selling Scottish pounds and drop their value and see what you do. So let's not get into that kind of conflict. The other way that we might try and do it, and this is a debate going on around the Growth Commission, which we have yet to see the final result of. But there is a suggestion that to go back to square one, just keep the pound sterling, but not bother if the Bank of England says no, not bother if the UK government says you can't do it, just keep the pound circulating here. What's to stop us? Other countries use the dollar, even though they're not United States. What's to stop us just using the pound anyway, pound sterling anyway? Well, you end up with all the problems we had at the beginning. If you just let the pound be there, you end up still ceding control to Bank of England and to UK Treasury. If you're going to have a pound, if you're going to you want control of your currency, then it seems to me that sterlingization, simply using the pound and doing it, buckshy without reference to London, is no better a solution than keeping the pound and doing it in agreement with the UK, which won't happen anyway. Seems to me you're inevitably, once you've eliminated all the other possibilities, you end up down the road of saying we need a Scottish currency. Now, what do you think? Can we get the lights up just for a second? Possible to put the lights up? House lights, just a second? I'll do my best. No, they're not going to let me, okay. I'm going to ask you what you think, right? So first of all, I want to see, wave your wallets or something. Those of you who would, okay, it's a difficult question, you might not be where your emotions lie, but in the end of the day, who would stick with sterling in an independent Scotland, at least as a transitional period? Who's for keeping sterling? There must be somebody. Well, okay. Right, there's a few, there's a couple on the back. Okay, we'll get your names later. Who wants to go to the euro as fast as you can do it? Yeah, no, it's usually about 5% people. It's a reasonable, it's the time transition. So who's for a Scottish currency? Can we see that? Are you listening in Scottish government? Okay, there we go, thank you. Right, that's my presentation, ladies and gentlemen.